Welcome to Creepy Shadow Stories. Tonight we bring you 7 verified road trip nightmares, real accounts from travelers who encountered unspeakable horrors on America's highways. Each story has been confirmed through police reports and first-hand interviews. From desert creatures that defy explanation to predators stalking interstate corridors, these tales will change how you see every rest stop and empty road ahead. Subscribe now for daily terror that chills to the bone. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss when darkness creeps beyond your headlights. Buckle up and lock your doors. The road to hell starts here. Story 1. My name is Royalty, and in the summer of 2020, when I was 19 years old, my family and I embarked on what was supposed to be a fun, memorable road trip through the American Southwest. We had been planning this vacation for months, seeing it as a way to bond and explore parts of the country none of us had ever seen before. My parents, my younger brother Marcus, who was 16, and my little sister Aria, who was 12, all piled into our family SUV for what we anticipated would be 2 weeks of adventure and stunning scenery. The trip started perfectly. We drove from our home in Colorado through Utah, marveling at the incredible alien red rock formations and majestic national parks. Everyone was getting along wonderfully, taking hundreds of photos and genuinely enjoying each other's company. My dad had mapped out our entire route with his usual meticulous care, planning exactly where we would stop each night and what attractions we wanted to visit along the way. By the 4th day of our trip, we were driving through a particularly remote and desolate section of Arizona, heading toward a resort town where we had reservations at a nice hotel. The landscape was absolutely breathtaking, but also incredibly oppressively isolated. We hadn't seen another car for over 2 hours, and our cell phone signals had vanished long ago. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. A silent, rust-colored ocean broken only by massive red sandstone formations that looked like the monuments of an ancient, forgotten civilization. That was when our SUV started having problems. It began with a strange metallic rattling sound coming from under the hood, followed by a gradual, sickening loss of power. My dad, who knew quite a bit about cars, immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. We managed to coast to the side of the highway, but when Dad popped the hood, he discovered that our serpentine belt had snapped, and several other engine components had been damaged in the process. We were stranded, helpless, in the middle of a vast nowhere with no cell phone service and no way to call for help. The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, and we knew that temperatures in the desert dropped dramatically after dark. Dad tried flagging down passing vehicles, but in over an hour of anxious waiting, not a single car came by in either direction. Just as a real sense of panic was beginning to set in about the prospect of spending the night in our disabled vehicle, we saw lights shimmering in the distance. About 2 miles ahead, there appeared to be some kind of building with flickering neon signs advertising a motel and restaurant. It looked like a mirage at first, a trick of the heat and fading light. But as we gathered our overnight bags and began the long walk toward it, the building became more and more real, a solid, tangible hope in the deepening twilight. The place was called the Desert Rose Motel, and it looked as if it had been built sometime in the 1960s and then simply forgotten by time. The architecture was classic roadside Americana, with a long, low row of rooms facing a central parking lot and a separate building that housed the office and restaurant. Faded neon signs advertised vacancy, air conditioning, and home-cooked meals, though several of the letters were burned out or flickered erratically, casting a sickly, buzzing glow. The parking lot contained about 6 other vehicles, which surprised us given how remote the location was. There was an old, rusted pickup truck, a couple of sedans that looked to be from the 1990s, a motorcycle, and what appeared to be a small, dilapidated RV. It was reassuring, at least, to know that we weren't the only travelers who had found this isolated outpost. The motel office was small and cramped, decorated with faded sun-bleached photographs of local landmarks and stacks of tourism brochures that looked like they were decades old. Behind the counter stood a woman who appeared to be in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and a friendly, practiced smile. She introduced herself as Martha and said she had been running the Desert Rose for over 20 years. Martha was extremely sympathetic about our car trouble and assured us that a mechanic would be by in the morning to take a look at our SUV. She said this kind of thing happened frequently on this desolate stretch of highway, and that she always kept a few rooms available for stranded motorists. The rates were very reasonable, and she even offered to let us eat dinner in the restaurant at no charge, a kind gesture considering we were dealing with unexpected car problems. We checked into 2 adjoining rooms, one for my parents and one for my siblings and me. The rooms were clean but definitely dated, with furniture and decor that looked like it hadn't been changed since the motel was first built. The beds were comfortable enough and the air conditioning unit rattled and groaned but worked, which was the most important thing given the lingering desert heat. Dinner in the restaurant was surprisingly good. The menu was simple, but the food was fresh and well prepared. There were a few other guests eating as well, including an elderly couple who said they had been staying at the motel for several days, and a middle-aged man traveling alone who claimed to be a traveling salesman. Everyone seemed friendly and perfectly normal. Just regular people who had found themselves at this remote desert motel for one reason or another. After dinner, we went back to our rooms and tried to get some rest. The plan was to get up early and hopefully get our car fixed so we could continue our vacation. Despite the unexpected complication, everyone was in good spirits, treating the whole ordeal as an amusing adventure rather than a disaster. That was when I started noticing that something was wrong with my family. It began with small, subtle things that could easily be explained away as stress or fatigue. My little sister Arya, who is normally a whirlwind of talkative, boundless energy, became quiet and withdrawn. When I asked her what was wrong, she just stared at me with a completely blank expression and said, "Everything is fine." But her voice sounded flat and emotionless, a hollow echo of her usual cheerful tone. My brother Marcus started acting strangely too. He kept staring out the window at the dark, empty desert, even though there was absolutely nothing to see in the pitch-black darkness. When I asked him what he was looking at, he turned to me with the same vacant expression that Arya had shown me and said, "I'm just enjoying the view." But his eyes looked different somehow, glassy and distant, as if the person I knew behind them had been replaced by something else. Even my parents seemed off. They were speaking to each other in low, urgent whispers, having intense conversations that would stop abruptly the moment I came near them. When I tried to join their discussions, they would awkwardly change the subject or act as if they hadn't been talking about anything important. This was completely unlike their normal behavior, especially on family vacations when they usually included my siblings and me in all of their planning and decision-making. By the second day, the changes in my family's behavior had become impossible to ignore or explain away. They moved differently, with a strange, almost rehearsed stiffness. They spoke differently, their words lacking any genuine emotion. They seemed to have lost all interest in the things that had always been important to them. Arya stopped asking when we could continue our trip. Marcus stopped complaining about being bored. My parents stopped discussing our itinerary or even asking about our car's repair progress. When I tried to voice my growing concerns, they all insisted that everything was normal and that I was just being paranoid. But their responses felt scripted, as if they were reciting lines they had memorized rather than having genuine conversations with me. The way they looked at me had changed too. Instead of the warm, familiar expressions I had known my entire life, their eyes now held a cold, calculating quality that made me deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. The other guests at the motel were acting strangely as well. The elderly couple I had met on our first night were still there, even though they had mentioned they were just passing through. The traveling salesman was also still there, and when I asked him about his business, he gave me vague, contradictory answers that made no sense. But the most disturbing presence was Martha, the motel owner. She seemed to be keeping close, constant tabs on all the guests, materializing whenever I tried to explore the property or ask too many questions about our car repair. She always had a ready, soothing explanation for any concerns I raised, but her answers felt evasive, and her smile never ever quite reached her cold, watchful eyes. On the third morning, I made a discovery that confirmed my worst, most nightmarish fears. While my family was having breakfast in the restaurant, I snuck out to check on our SUV, which was supposedly being repaired in the motel's garage. When I managed to lift the hood, I could see that absolutely nothing had been done to fix the problems. In fact, it looked like additional deliberate damage had been inflicted on the engine, as if someone was systematically ensuring that we could never leave. That was when I finally understood. We were not guests at this motel, we were prisoners. I started paying closer attention to the other people at the Desert Rose, and I began to notice impossible, terrifying details. None of them cast proper shadows in the bright, harsh desert sunlight. Their reflections in windows and mirrors were distorted and warped, or sometimes chillingly missing entirely. And occasionally, when they thought no one was looking, their human facades would slip for just a fraction of a second, revealing horrifying glimpses of something else lurking underneath. The thing that looked like my little sister would sometimes forget to blink for minutes at a time, its stare fixed and inhuman. The thing that looked like my brother would move with an unnatural, boneless fluidity that no human body could possibly achieve. The things that looked like my parents would have hushed conversations using strange words and guttural phrases that were not part of their normal vocabulary. I realized with a wave of cold dread that whatever had happened to my real family, these creatures had taken their place. They had studied my family closely enough to mimic their physical appearances and basic mannerisms, but they couldn't perfectly replicate the subtle, intricate details that make each person unique. They were wearing my family like masks, and they were doing an increasingly poor and careless job of maintaining the illusion. The terrifying question was, what had happened to the real Marcus, Arya, and my parents? And how long did I have before whatever had taken them decided to replace me as well? I started planning my escape, knowing it had to be done with extreme care. The creatures that had replaced my family were watching me constantly, their cold eyes following my every move, and Martha seemed to have an uncanny, supernatural ability to appear whenever I tried to do anything suspicious. I needed to find a way to get away from the motel and find help, but a part of me also desperately needed to figure out if there was any way to save my real family. On the fourth night, I pretended to go to sleep early, but actually stayed wide awake, listening intently to what was happening in the adjoining room. Through the paper-thin walls, I could hear the creatures that looked like my parents having a conversation, but they were not speaking English or any other human language. The sounds they made were guttural, clicking, and animalistic, like nothing any human throat could possibly produce. Around midnight, I heard them leave their room. Peering through a crack in my window's dusty curtains, I watched in horror as all the guests at the motel, including the things that looked like my family, gathered in the center of the parking lot. They stood in a silent, solemn circle around something in the center that I couldn't quite see clearly. They began making those same inhuman, guttural sounds in what appeared to be some kind of dark ritual or ceremony. That was when I saw them begin to change. Their human appearances started to melt away like hot wax, revealing their true, horrific forms underneath. They were tall, gaunt creatures with unnaturally elongated limbs and faces that were a horrifying, twisted mixture of human and animal features. Their skin was a mottled, sickly gray color, and their eyes glowed with a faint yellow light in the oppressive darkness. In the center of their circle, I could now see what looked like a dark pit or hole in the ground. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, they began to drag something out of the pit. It was a human body, but it was too dark and too far away for me to identify who it was. They carried the body toward the motel building, and I realized with a fresh wave of terror that they were bringing it to one of the empty rooms. I knew that I had to escape immediately before they completed whatever grotesque ritual they were performing. I quietly gathered my belongings and slipped out the back window of my room, carefully avoiding the parking lot where the creatures were still gathered. Using the dark, alien landscape of the desert as cover, I began making my way toward the highway, desperately hoping to flag down a passing vehicle or at least get far enough away to find a cell phone signal. The desert at night was terrifyingly vast and disorienting. Without the motel's sickly lights as a reference point, I quickly became lost among the monolithic rock formations and sandy, winding washes. I walked for what felt like hours, following what I hoped was the direction of the highway. But I never found the road or encountered any other signs of civilization. Just as the sun was beginning to cast a pale gray light over the eastern horizon, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 2 police cars appeared over a rise, followed by an ambulance and what looked like a black federal government vehicle. They found me dehydrated, exhausted, and barely conscious after wandering in the desert all night. The officers told me that they had been looking for my family and me after we failed to check in at our hotel reservation in the resort town. When they traced our probable route and found our abandoned SUV, they had conducted a thorough search of the area and discovered the Desert Rose Motel. But when they arrived at the motel, they found it completely, utterly abandoned. There were no guests, no staff, and no sign that anyone had been there recently. More disturbing still, when they checked the county's registration records and business licenses, they discovered that the Desert Rose Motel had been permanently closed and condemned for over 15 years. The building was slated for demolition, though the process had been delayed for years by legal disputes over the property's ownership. My real family was never found. Despite extensive searches of the area and investigations by multiple law enforcement agencies, not a single trace of Marcus, Arya, or my parents was ever discovered. The official conclusion was that they had somehow gotten lost in the vast desert and died of exposure, but their bodies were never recovered. I know the truth, though. Somewhere out in that vast, silent desert, there is a place that exists outside of normal reality. A place where monstrous creatures take the forms of human beings and prey on travelers who are unlucky enough to become stranded. My family is still there, trapped in whatever horrifying dimension or realm the Desert Rose Motel actually occupies. And sometimes, late at night, I still get phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear voices that sound exactly like my parents and my siblings asking me when I'm coming home, telling me how much they miss me, begging me to come back to the desert and find them. But I know that whatever is making those calls is not my real family. It is something else. Something that wants to complete its grotesque collection by adding me to their number. I will never return to that part of the country. And I will never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when those creatures decide to come looking for me. Story 2. Back in the summer of 2019, my name is Jackson, and I was 22 years old, with absolutely no premonition that a simple cross-country road trip was about to unravel into the most profoundly terrifying experience of my life. I had just emerged from college clutching a marketing degree when my best friends, Princeton and Camden, managed to convince me to embark on one final great adventure before we all surrendered to our adult careers. We settled on renting an RV and tracing a path from our quiet hometown in Ohio all the way to the California coast, deliberately choosing the scenic route that would wind us through some of America's most remote and achingly beautiful landscapes. Princeton, ever the meticulous planner of our group since our high school days, had meticulously mapped out our entire journey, ensuring we would pass through all the major national parks and scenic byways. Camden, with his experience driving larger vehicles from a summer job at a moving company, was our designated driver for the majority of the trip, and I was simply along for the ride, filled with an eager anticipation to witness parts of the country I had only ever glimpsed in films and documentaries. We were young, infused with a sense of invincibility and utterly terrifyingly unprepared for what awaited us in the vast silent desert. The RV we rented was a 30-foot Trailblazer Voyager. It was nothing extravagant, but it held everything we required for 2 weeks on the open road: 3 beds, a compact kitchen, a bathroom, and enough storage to swallow our camping gear and supplies. Princeton had provisioned it with enough food to sustain a small army, while Camden contributed his collection of survival gear, which he swore would be indispensable in an emergency. I brought my camera equipment, hoping to chronicle our adventure and perhaps generate some content for my social media feeds. For the first week, everything unfolded with a flawless rhythm. We moved through Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, and into Arkansas without a single issue. The RV handled like a dream. We were making excellent time, and the weather remained stubbornly perfect. We made stops in quaint small towns, exchanged stories with friendly locals, and captured hundreds of photographs of landscapes that stole our breath. By the time we crossed into Oklahoma, we felt like seasoned road warriors, saturated with a complete confidence in our ability to conquer whatever the road might throw at us. The trouble began with our decision to detour through New Mexico and Arizona, veering away from the predictable safety of the main interstate highways. Princeton had been reading about a scenic route that promised to guide us through incredible desert landscapes deep within authentic Native American territory. The guidebook he clutched described it as one of the most beautiful and untouched stretches of highway in the Southwest, perfect for adventurous travelers seeking to experience the real, untamed America. We entered New Mexico on a Tuesday afternoon, and the shift in the landscape was immediate and stark. The rolling green hills and dense forests we had grown used to were gone, replaced by vast, silent expanses of red rock formations, towering mesas, and an endless desert that seemed to stretch into eternity in every direction. The isolation was a double-edged sword, beautiful and profoundly unnerving, a feeling that intensified when we realized we hadn't seen another vehicle for well over an hour. The highway we were on was a thin 2-lane ribbon of asphalt cutting directly through the heart of the desert. There were no gas stations, no rest stops, not a single sign of civilization to break the oppressive emptiness. According to our GPS, the next town was still a desolate 100 miles away. Princeton assured us this was normal for this part of the country and that our fuel tanks were more than sufficient to reach our next planned stop. Camden was growing visibly nervous about piloting such a large vehicle on such narrow roads, but the pavement was in good condition and the visibility was unnervingly clear. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, we started searching for a place to pull over and establish our camp for the night. We had been driving for nearly 8 solid hours, and a deep weariness had settled into our bones. About 20 miles outside a small town named Shiprock, we discovered a dirt road that branched off toward what looked to be an abandoned rest area. There were weathered concrete picnic tables, stone fire pits, and even restroom facilities, though they had clearly been left to decay for several years. The location seemed perfect for our needs. We were far enough from the main highway to avoid being disturbed by any passing traffic, yet close enough to easily rejoin the road in the morning. The landscape encircling us was absolutely stunning, with massive red rock formations creating a natural, silent amphitheater around our campsite. Princeton immediately began taking pictures, his shutter clicking in the quiet air. while Camden started arranging our outdoor furniture and coaxing a fire to life in one of the existing pits. I was inside the RV preparing dinner when I first sensed that something was wrong. It was just after sunset, and the desert had assumed that ethereal purple glow that photographers chase. I was gazing out the small window above the sink when I detected movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned my head to look directly at it, there was nothing, just the empty desert and the stoic watching rock formations. I dismissed it, convincing myself it was likely just a coyote or some other desert creature, and returned to my cooking. Dinner was delicious, and we passed the evening huddled around the fire, sharing stories and mapping out the next day's drive. The desert night was a profound, bottomless silence, punctuated only by the occasional lonely howl of distant coyotes and the soft crackling of our fire. The stars overhead were more brilliant than any of us had ever witnessed, a dense, shimmering canopy, and we spent hours lying on our backs, just gazing up at the Milky Way. By 11 o'clock, we were all thoroughly exhausted and ready for bed. That was when the scratching began. At first, it was so subtle I thought I might be imagining it. A soft, scraping sound like fingernails dragging across wood, originating from somewhere directly above my head. I was in the bed positioned over the driver's cab, while Princeton and Camden were in their bunks further back in the RV. I held my breath and listened intently for several minutes, trying to discern if the sound was real or merely the RV's frame groaning as it settled in the cooling desert air. The scratching continued. It was definitely real, and it was definitely coming from the roof, directly above where I lay. It moved in a deliberate, measured pattern, starting at one end of the RV and slowly, methodically traveling toward the other as if something were pacing across the roof. But that made no sense. We were in the middle of a vast emptiness miles from any trees an animal could have used to climb onto the RV. The scratching was too loud, too purposeful to be the wind. I called out softly to Princeton and Camden, my voice a tentative whisper in the dark, asking if they could hear it too. Princeton mumbled something about it probably being a raccoon or a possum, his voice thick with sleep, while Camden suggested it might be a branch or some piece of debris that had gotten wedged on the roof during our drive. Neither of them seemed particularly concerned, and both quickly drifted back to sleep. But I remained wide awake, my ears straining in the darkness, listening to the scraping sounds that persisted for nearly an hour before finally, abruptly, stopping. The next morning, Camden clambered onto the roof to investigate while Princeton and I cleaned up the campsite. He found absolutely nothing that could have produced the sounds we heard. No scratches marred the RV's fiberglass roof. No debris. No animal tracks in the fine layer of dust that had settled up there. The roof was utterly clean and undamaged. We all agreed it was probably just the RV's materials expanding and contracting as the temperature fluctuated, and we hit the road again, pushing the unsettling memory aside. The second night was worse. We had driven deeper into Arizona following a highway that seemed to grow more isolated with each passing mile. We had not encountered another vehicle all day, and our cell phones had lost their signal hours before. As evening descended, we found another abandoned rest area hauntingly similar to the one from the previous night. This one was even more remote, hemmed in by towering red sandstone formations that created the unnerving sensation of being inside a vast, ancient outdoor cathedral. The scratching began again around midnight, but this time it was far more aggressive. Instead of the subtle scraping sounds from the night before, this sounded like sharp claws digging, tearing into the fiberglass roof. The sounds moved back and forth, covering the entire length of the RV. Sometimes rapid and frantic, sometimes slow and deliberate, but always purposeful. Princeton and Camden were both wide awake this time, and the three of us lay frozen in our beds, listening to whatever was moving around just inches above us. Camden whispered that we should go outside and investigate, But Princeton firmly and wisely vetoed that idea. He insisted that whatever was up there might be dangerous and that we should wait for the safety of morning to figure out what was happening. I agreed with Princeton mostly because the thought of stepping out into the pitch-black desert to confront an unknown creature filled me with a primal dread. We spent the remainder of the night taking turns keeping watch. Our faces pressed to the windows, but none of us saw anything in the oppressive darkness. Morning brought another exhaustive inspection of the roof, and once again Camden found absolutely nothing. This time, however, he did find something deeply disturbing around the perimeter of our campsite. In the soft, undisturbed sand encircling the RV, there were footprints. But they were not animal prints, and they were most definitely not human. They looked almost human in their basic shape, yet they were much larger than any human foot should be, with what appeared to be long claw marks extending from each toe. The prints formed a complete unbroken circle around the RV, as if something had spent the entire night pacing around and around our vehicle, studying us. Some of the prints were so close to the RV that whatever made them would have been able to simply reach out and touch the sides. The thought of something stalking us as we slept was utterly terrifying, and we immediately began to break down our campsite with frantic energy. As we prepared to leave, Princeton made a discovery that sent a sliver of ice through our veins. On the back bumper of the RV, drawn in what looked like mud or wet clay, were symbols that none of us recognized. They looked vaguely like Native American petroglyphs, but cruder, more primitive, and filled with a palpable malice. The symbols had definitely not been there the previous evening when we had set up camp. Someone or something had marked our vehicle during the night. The third night was when everything descended into absolute chaos. We had driven almost 300 miles that day, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had been stalking us. We reached a small town called Window Rock just before sunset. When we tried to find a motel or a campground, we discovered that every single place was either fully booked or closed for renovations. Our only option was to find another isolated spot to spend the night, a prospect none of us wanted to face but which seemed grimly unavoidable. About 10 miles outside of town, we found what appeared to be a legitimate campground, complete with concrete pads, electrical hookups, and well-maintained restroom facilities. There was even a small general store, though it was locked up for the evening. The campground was completely, unnervingly empty except for us, which should have been our first screaming warning sign. But we were exhausted, running low on fresh water, and we decided to risk one more night in the desert. The scratching started earlier this time, just after sunset, while we were still awake and moving around inside the RV. But it was no longer just scratching. We could now hear what sounded like voices, muffled, distorted, and inhuman, coming from just outside the RV. The voices seemed to be mimicking sounds that we had made earlier, playing back snippets of our conversations from during the day. But the words were wrong somehow, twisted and unnatural, like a corrupted recording. Princeton grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and announced, his voice tight, that he was going outside to see what was happening. Camden and I both pleaded with him to stop, but he was determined to solve this mystery once and for all. He wrenched open the RV door and stepped out into the encroaching darkness, sweeping his flashlight beam in wide, erratic arcs. For a moment, an absolute ringing silence fell over the campground. Then Princeton started screaming. Through the windows, we saw him sprinting back toward the RV, his flashlight beam cutting a wild, panicked path through the darkness as he ran for his life. Behind him, caught at the very edge of the light, we saw something pursuing him. It was humanoid in shape, but it moved in a way that no human ever could, covering the ground in impossible loping bounds that seemed to defy the laws of gravity. Princeton reached the RV and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him and fumbling with all the locks. He was hyperventilating, his words coming in ragged, broken gasps. But he managed to choke out what he had seen. The thing chasing him had looked human from a distance, but up close it was clearly something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent in the wrong directions, and its face was a horrific, nightmarish fusion of human and animal features. That was when we realized that the voices we had been hearing were not just random, distorted sounds. They were our voices, exact recordings of conversations we had been having all day, played back to us with chilling precision by something that had been listening, learning, and waiting. Whatever was stalking us had been studying us, preparing for this exact moment when we were at our most vulnerable. The attacks on the RV escalated, becoming increasingly violent throughout the long night. Whatever was outside was trying to get in, clawing at the walls, pounding on the roof with terrifying force, and systematically testing every possible entry point. At one point, something seized the thick electrical cable connecting us to the campground hookup and began to pull, yanking the entire RV back and forth, rocking us violently from side to side like a child's toy. Camden scrambled into the driver's seat and tried to start the RV's engine so we could drive away, but only a dead click answered when he turned the key. We checked under the hood and discovered a scene of deliberate sabotage. Several critical engine components had been ripped out or smashed beyond repair. We were stranded, helpless, in the middle of nowhere with something inhuman methodically trying to tear its way in. Our only shelter was a recreational vehicle that was being systematically dismantled by a creature that seemed to possess impossible strength and a terrifying, calculating intelligence. Just before the first light of dawn, everything suddenly stopped. The scratching, the voices, the violent rocking of the RV, all of it ceased, as if a switch had been thrown. We huddled inside for over an hour, the silence now more terrifying than the noise, before we finally worked up the courage to peer outside. The campground appeared completely normal, bathed in the soft morning light with no sign whatsoever of the creature that had terrorized us all night. A passing highway patrol officer found us later that morning and helped us arrange for the RV to be towed to the nearest town for repairs. When we described our experience to the mechanic, a grizzled old man with knowing eyes, his face went pale and he immediately urgently recommended that we leave the area as quickly as possible. He told us that what we had encountered was something the local Native American tribes had been warning people about for centuries, and that we were incredibly lucky to have survived the encounter. We never discovered exactly what had stalked us for those 3 nightmarish nights in the desert. The mechanic refused to discuss it in any further detail, and the few locals we dared to speak with would only shake their heads grimly and advise us never to return to that part of the country. We cut our road trip short and drove straight back home to Ohio, consumed by a gratitude for being alive and vowing never to travel through that desolate region again. To this day, none of us can fully explain what transpired during those 3 nights in the New Mexico and Arizona desert. But I know that somewhere out there, in that vast silent wilderness, something inhuman is still stalking travelers who venture too far from the fragile safety of civilization. And I know that I will never forget the chilling sound of our own voices being played back to us by something that should not exist. Story 3. My name is Sam. At 43 years old, I had been driving long-haul trucks for over 2 decades when I encountered something that nearly brought an end to both my career and my life. I had always taken pride in being one of the most experienced and safety-conscious drivers on the road. I knew every major truck stop, every treacherous stretch of highway, and every devious trick that criminals use to prey on truckers. But in the autumn of 2018, I learned a hard lesson. Sometimes experience and caution are not enough to shield you from the monsters that hunt along America's great highways. I was hauling a valuable load of electronics from a warehouse in Ohio to a distribution center in Phoenix, a familiar route I had driven dozens of times over the years. It was a straightforward run that typically took about 36 hours of driving. spread over 4 days with mandatory rest stops to comply with Department of Transportation regulations. I was behind the wheel of a 2017 Titan Hauler Prime pulling a 53-foot trailer, a reliable combination that had never given me any serious trouble. The first 3 days of the trip unfolded exactly as planned. I made good time crossing through Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and into Oklahoma without any complications. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was actually running about 2 hours ahead of schedule. By the evening of the third day, I was feeling confident that I would complete the delivery early, perhaps even finding time to visit an old friend who lived near Phoenix. That confidence evaporated the moment I pulled into a truck stop just outside of Amarillo, Texas. The place was called the Mirage Rest Stop, a large, sprawling facility that catered specifically to long-haul truckers. It had everything we needed: diesel fuel, a 24-hour diner, shower facilities, a small convenience store, and a massive parking lot for about 50 trucks. I had stopped there many times over the years and had always found it to be well-maintained and professionally operated. The staff was friendly, the food was decent, and the security seemed better than most places along that particular route. I navigated my rig into the parking area around 9 o'clock in the evening, with a simple plan to fuel up, grab a quick dinner, and get some sleep before tackling the final leg of my journey the next morning. The lot was about half full, which was typical for that time of night. I found a spot near the back of the lot where I would have plenty of room to maneuver in the pre-dawn hours, and went through my standard routine of checking my load securement and performing a basic inspection of my truck. That was when I first noticed the blue sedan. It was parked at the very edge of the truck parking area, an unusual spot since regular passenger vehicles were supposed to use the separate car parking section closer to the main building. The car appeared to be occupied, though I couldn't see clearly through the darkly tinted windows. Something about the situation felt immediately off, a dissonant note in the familiar symphony of the truck stop. But I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was setting off my internal alarms. I went inside to get dinner and handle some paperwork. The diner was busy but not overcrowded, filled mostly with other truck drivers on schedules similar to mine. I chose a booth near the window where I could keep an eye on my truck while I ate, a habit I had ingrained after having equipment stolen from unsecured trailers earlier in my career. While I was eating, I struck up a conversation with another driver named Bill, who was hauling furniture from North Carolina to California. He was about my age and had a similar depth of experience on the road, so we naturally fell into comparing notes about routes, fuel prices, and recent changes in DOT regulations. It was the kind of easy, casual conversation that echoes through truck stops all across the country. During our talk, Bill mentioned that he had been seeing the same blue sedan at several different truck stops along his route over the past 3 days. He described how it was always parked in the same suspicious manner, away from the main parking areas but perfectly positioned so its occupants could watch the truckers coming and going. He had even reported it to security at one location, but by the time they bothered to investigate, the car had vanished into the night. This information immediately seized my attention because I was now looking at the very same vehicle Bill had been describing. We compared our routes and realized we had been traveling along remarkably similar paths, stopping at many of the same locations. If someone in that blue sedan was following truckers, they had been tracking both of us for several days. Bill suggested we contact local law enforcement. But when we asked the truck stop security office to call the police, they told us that unless a specific crime had been committed, there was nothing they could do about someone parking legally in a public area. They said they would keep an eye on the situation, but their dismissive tone suggested they thought we were being paranoid. After dinner, I returned to my truck to prepare for sleep. I had a comfortable sleeper cab equipped with a bed, a small refrigerator, and the basic amenities that allowed me to live on the road for weeks at a time. I went through my normal evening ritual of checking my doors and windows, reviewing my logbook, and setting my alarm for an early departure. Before settling down for the night, I took one last sweeping look around the parking lot. The blue sedan was still there, but it had now moved to a different location. It was parked behind a row of trailers where it would be harder to see from the main building, but was still positioned to observe the truck parking area. This confirmed my suspicions. Whoever was in that car was deliberately, methodically watching the truckers. I decided to take some extra precautions. I triple-locked all my doors, made sure my cell phone was fully charged and within easy reach, and placed a heavy tire iron under my pillow where I could access it instantly if needed. I also made a careful note of the sedan's license plate number and sent a text message to my dispatcher with all the details, asking them to contact authorities if they didn't hear from me by my scheduled check-in time the next morning. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the soft metallic click of someone trying the door handle on my truck. I remained perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat, and listened intently, trying to determine how many people were outside and what they might be planning. Through the thin curtains of my sleeper cab, I could discern the shadowy forms of at least 2 figures moving around my truck, silently testing doors and examining the trailer coupling. One of them was using a small, focused light, likely from a cell phone, to inspect something near the rear of my trailer. The other person was at the driver's side of the cab, apparently trying to gauge if I was inside and awake. Their movements were quiet, deliberate, and practiced. They were clearly experienced at whatever they were attempting to do. I quietly reached for my cell phone to call 911, but when I looked at the screen, I saw I had no signal. This was extremely unusual. The truck stop was located right off a major highway, and cellular coverage in the area had always been excellent during my previous visits. Someone was jamming the cell phone signals, which meant this was not some random opportunistic theft attempt, but a coordinated, sophisticated attack. The people outside my truck were now having a hushed, whispered conversation, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. After a few tense minutes, they moved away from my truck, and I heard a car door slam softly somewhere in the distance. I waited for another hour, my heart pounding against my ribs, before carefully looking out to see if they had left the area. The blue sedan was gone, but I noticed that several other trucks in the parking lot now had small, dark devices attached to their trailer hitches or bumpers. They appeared to be some kind of tracking equipment, most likely GPS units that would allow the criminals to follow specific vehicles after they left the relative safety of the truck stop. I immediately began checking my own truck for similar devices, using a flashlight to meticulously examine every possible hiding place where something could be attached. I found it, a small magnetic device stuck to the underside of my trailer, positioned where it would be almost impossible to spot during a normal pre-trip inspection. The device was about the size of a matchbox and appeared to be a high-end GPS tracker. It had a small antenna and what looked like a cellular modem, suggesting it could transmit real-time location data to whoever was monitoring it. I carefully pried it off and placed it inside a metal container in my cab that I knew would block any signals it might be sending. At this point, I realized I was dealing with something far more serious than simple truck stop crime. Someone was systematically tracking long-haul truckers, probably with the intention of robbing them at isolated locations along their routes. The fact that they were employing cell phone jammers and sophisticated tracking equipment suggested this was a well-organized, well-funded criminal operation. I started my truck and immediately drove to the front of the truck stop, where I parked directly under the brightest lights available and used a payphone to call 911. When the police arrived about 20 minutes later, I showed them the tracking device and explained everything that had transpired during the night. The officers took my report with grave seriousness and began their investigation immediately. They discovered similar tracking devices on 8 other trucks in the parking lot, and found that the blue sedan I had been seeing was registered to a known felon who was wanted in connection with several violent truck hijackings in Texas and New Mexico. Over the next few hours, more law enforcement officers arrived, including detectives from a multi-state task force that had been investigating a string of truck-related crimes. They informed me that my report had provided them with the crucial evidence they needed, confirming their suspicions about a dangerous criminal organization that was targeting long-haul truckers throughout the Southwest. The investigation revealed that the criminals were using truck stops as surveillance points to identify valuable loads, and then track the truckers to isolated areas where they could be robbed without any witnesses. In several tragic cases, drivers who had resisted were seriously injured or killed. The tracking devices allowed the criminals to follow their targets for hundreds of miles, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The man in the blue sedan turned out to be part of a larger, insidious network that included corrupt truck stop employees who provided inside information about valuable shipments and driver schedules. They had been operating for over 2 years and were responsible for at least 15 truck hijackings and 3 homicides. Thanks to the evidence I provided and the cooperation of other drivers who had also noticed suspicious activity, law enforcement was able to arrest 7 people involved in the operation. The leader of the group was eventually convicted of multiple felonies, including murder, armed robbery, and racketeering, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The experience fundamentally altered how I approach truck stop security. I now perform much more thorough inspections of my vehicle at every single stop, and I am hyper-aware of other people in truck stop parking areas. I also carry additional communication equipment that cannot be easily jammed, and I maintain regular contact with other drivers who travel similar routes. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts without question when something feels wrong. The criminal organization that targeted me was sophisticated and well organized, but they made a critical mistake. They were too persistent in their surveillance. By paying close attention to patterns and details that seemed out of place, I was able to identify the threat before it became deadly. The trucking industry has since implemented additional security measures, including better lighting at truck stops, improved communication systems, and increased coordination with law enforcement agencies. But the threat still exists, a shadow lurking in the periphery, and drivers need to remain vigilant about the possibility of being targeted by criminals who view us as easy prey. Every time I stop at a truck stop now, especially during the deep, silent hours of the night, I remember that night in Texas when I came closer to becoming another statistic than I ever want to experience again. The highway can be a dangerous place, not just because of traffic accidents or mechanical failures, but because there are people out there who make their living by preying on those of us who make our living on the road. I still love being a truck driver, and I still believe that the vast majority of people I encounter are honest and decent. But I will never again underestimate the critical importance of staying alert and being prepared for the chilling possibility that someone might be watching, waiting for just the right moment to turn a routine stop into a living nightmare. Story 4. My name is Jason, and I need to tell you about the worst 3 hours of my life. They happened in March of 2019 when my younger brother, also named Jason, and I were driving across the country to start new jobs in California. At 31 years old, I had finally landed my dream position as a software engineer at a prestigious tech company in San Jose, while Jason, who was 28, had been offered a management role at the same company's logistics division. We were both incredibly excited about this fresh start and had decided to make the move together, driving across the country in a rented moving truck packed with everything we owned. Jason and I had always been close despite our different personalities. I was the cautious, analytical one who planned every detail in advance, while he was more spontaneous and inherently trusting of people. We balanced each other out well, and this cross-country move felt like the perfect opportunity for us to begin a new chapter of our lives in a place where we could both pursue our ambitious career goals. The moving truck we had rented was a 26-foot Nomad mover, large enough to hold the contents of both of our apartments. We had loaded it carefully over 2 painstaking days, making sure everything was properly secured for the long, arduous drive ahead. The plan was to drive from our hometown of Cleveland, Ohio to San Jose in 4 days, taking turns behind the wheel and staying in cheap motels along the way. The first 3 days of our trip went off without a hitch. We made excellent time driving through the flat landscapes of Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and into the rugged beauty of Colorado. The weather was beautiful, the truck was running smoothly, and we were both in high spirits about our upcoming new jobs. We spent hours talking about our plans for California, the apartments we hoped to find, and how different our lives were about to become on the West Coast. On the 4th morning, we left Denver before sunrise and began the final grueling push toward California. We were planning to drive straight through to San Jose, a daunting distance of about 1,200 miles that would take us approximately 18 hours with brief stops for fuel and food. It was an ambitious plan, but we were both eager to reach our destination and finally begin our new lives. The problems began when we stopped for lunch at a desolate rest area just outside of Grand Junction, Colorado. The rest area was a standard highway facility with a few picnic tables, restrooms, and vending machines. It wasn't particularly busy, with maybe a dozen other vehicles scattered across the parking area when we arrived around noon. The location seemed safe and well-maintained, exactly the kind of place where travelers regularly stop without a single thought about security. We parked the moving truck in a spot that would give us plenty of room to maneuver when we were ready to leave, and walked over to one of the picnic tables to eat the sandwiches we had packed for lunch. The day was warm and sunny, and it felt good to get out of the truck's cramped cab and stretch our legs after driving for several hours. While we were eating, a man approached our table and asked if we needed any help with directions or recommendations for places to stop along our route. He appeared to be in his 40s, was casually dressed, and seemed genuinely friendly and helpful. He introduced himself as Mike and said he was a local who often helped out travelers who were passing through the area. Mike asked where we were headed, and when we told him we were moving to California, he became noticeably more interested in our story. He asked about our jobs, where we were planning to live, and how long we had been planning the move. His questions seemed like normal, harmless small talk at the time. But looking back, I realize he was methodically gathering intelligence about us and our situation. After talking for about 10 minutes, Mike excused himself and walked back toward the parking area. Jason and I finished our lunch and were getting ready to continue our drive when we noticed that Mike was now talking to 2 other men near a beat-up pickup truck that hadn't been there when we arrived. The 3 of them kept glancing over in our direction as they talked, which made me deeply uncomfortable. I suggested to Jason that we should leave immediately, but he thought I was being paranoid. He pointed out that we hadn't seen or heard anything that was actually threatening, and that the men might just be curious about our large moving truck, or perhaps planning their own travel routes. Jason has always been more trusting than me, and he convinced me that I was overreacting to what was probably just a normal interaction between fellow travelers. We walked back to our truck and I started the engine while Jason went to secure some items in the cab that had shifted during the morning's drive. That was when the 3 men approached us. Mike came to the driver's side window while the other 2 men positioned themselves strategically on either side of the truck, cutting off any escape. Mike's entire demeanor had completely changed from the friendly traveler we had met just minutes earlier. His voice was now cold, flat, and commanding, and he was holding something in his right hand that I couldn't quite see clearly. He told me to turn off the engine and get out of the truck. When I asked why, he revealed what he was holding: a knife with a wicked-looking 4-inch blade that glinted in the sunlight. He said that he and his friends needed our truck and everything in it, and that if we cooperated, nobody would get hurt. He made it chillingly clear that if we resisted or tried to call for help, the situation would become much more dangerous for both of us. I glanced over at Jason, whose face had gone pale but who was trying to remain calm. The other two men were now clearly visible, and I could see that at least one of them was also armed. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and in the middle of nowhere with no immediate help available. The rest area had emptied out while we were eating lunch, and there were no other people around to witness what was happening. Mike ordered me to get out of the truck and toss him the keys. I complied, clinging to the desperate hope that they would just take the truck and leave us there. But instead of simply driving away with our belongings, they forced both Jason and me to walk toward their pickup truck. It became sickeningly clear that they weren't just planning to steal our moving truck. They were planning to take us somewhere else as well. That was when the full horror of the situation crashed down on me. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a kidnapping. The men forced us into the cramped back seat of their pickup truck, with one of them sitting between us to prevent any attempt to escape or fight back. Mike got behind the wheel and started driving away from the rest area, heading in the opposite direction from the main highway, deeper into the desolate landscape. We were being taken to a secondary location, which I knew from crime shows and news reports was usually when bad situations became deadly. During the drive, the men openly discussed what they were planning to do with us. They talked about holding us for ransom, selling our identities and personal information, and worst of all, eliminating us entirely so we couldn't identify them to the police. They seemed to be experienced criminals who had done this kind of thing before, and they discussed our fates with a casual, detached attitude that was absolutely terrifying. After about 20 minutes of driving on dusty, unpaved back roads, we arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned farm or ranch. There were several rundown buildings, including a large decaying barn and a house that looked as if it had been empty for years. This was clearly a place where the criminals could operate without being seen or heard by anyone. They forced us out of the pickup truck and marched us toward the barn. Inside, I could see that this was some kind of base of operations for their criminal activities. There were tools, coils of rope, rolls of duct tape, and other supplies that suggested they had been planning and executing kidnappings for some time. There were also personal items strewn about, wallets, jewelry, and cell phones that had obviously been taken from other victims. The realization that we were not their first victims was utterly horrifying. These men were seasoned predators who had likely kidnapped and possibly killed other people in this very same location. Jason and I were just their latest targets, chosen because we appeared to be affluent enough to be worth robbing and isolated enough to be taken without witnesses. They tied our hands tightly behind our backs and forced us to sit on the cold dirt floor while they discussed their next steps. Mike seemed to be the leader of the group, and he was arguing with the other two men about whether to demand ransom from our families or to simply take everything we had and dispose of us immediately. The casual, businesslike way they discussed ending our lives was more terrifying than any movie or TV show I had ever seen. While they were arguing, I was desperately trying to think of a way to escape or signal for help. The barn had several grimy windows, but they were too high to reach and probably too dirty for anyone outside to see through. The doors were heavy and would creak loudly if we tried to open them. Our cell phones had been taken from us, so we had no way to call for help, even if we could somehow get free from the ropes. Then I remembered that I had activated a GPS tracking service on the moving truck as part of the rental agreement. The service was designed to help the rental company locate their vehicles if they were stolen, but it also meant that our families would be able to track our location if we failed to check in as planned. If these criminals kept the truck in the same area where they were holding us, there was a chance, however slim, that law enforcement could find us. I decided to try to buy us some time by convincing the criminals that we were worth more alive than dead. I told Mike that our families had money and would pay a substantial ransom for our safe return. I also told him that our new employer was expecting us to report for work the very next day, and that if we didn't show up, they would immediately contact the authorities and begin looking for us. This information seemed to capture Mike's interest, and he began asking more detailed questions about our financial situations and our family's ability to pay a ransom. I provided him with partially true information, making us seem valuable enough to keep alive while carefully avoiding giving him enough details to actually contact our families or cause them additional harm. While Mike was focused on interrogating me, Jason was quietly, patiently working on loosening the ropes around his wrists. The criminals had tied us up quickly and had not checked their work very carefully. After about an hour of painstaking, silent manipulation, Jason managed to free his hands without attracting the attention of our captors. When Mike and the other two men left the barn to discuss their plans in private, Jason quickly untied me, and we began searching for a way to escape. The barn had a back door that was partially hidden behind some old rusted farm equipment, and we were able to open it quietly and slip outside without being seen. We found ourselves in a densely wooded area behind the barn, with no clear path back to the main road, but we could hear the faint, distant hum of traffic, which meant that civilization wasn't too far away. We began moving as quickly and quietly as we could through the woods, trying to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and the criminals before they realized we had escaped. After about 30 minutes of frantic hiking through dense forest, we stumbled out onto a paved road where we were able to flag down a passing motorist who called 911 for us. The police arrived within minutes and immediately began organizing a search for the criminals in our stolen moving truck. Law enforcement was able to track the GPS signal from our moving truck directly to the abandoned farm where we had been held captive. They found our truck and arrested all three criminals, who were still at the location planning their next move. It turned out that Mike and his associates were wanted in connection with several other kidnappings and robberies in Colorado and the surrounding states. The investigation revealed that the criminals had been operating their kidnapping scheme for over 2 years, targeting travelers who appeared to have valuable belongings or financial resources. They had been using the abandoned farm as their base of operations, and police found evidence connecting them to at least 8 other cases involving missing persons and stolen vehicles. We were incredibly, miraculously fortunate to have escaped when we did. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that the criminals had been planning to kill us that very evening. Regardless of whether our families paid any ransom demand, they had murdered at least 3 other victims in similar circumstances. And our case was just the latest in a series of horrific crimes that might have continued indefinitely if we hadn't escaped and led the police to their hidden location. The experience fundamentally changed both Jason and me. We both developed a lingering anxiety about traveling, especially in remote areas, and we became much more cautious and wary about interacting with strangers. The trust and optimism that had characterized our relationship with the world was replaced by a constant nagging awareness of potential threats and dangers. We did eventually make it to California and start our new jobs, but the shadow of that terrifying experience followed us for years. We both sought therapy to deal with the trauma, and it took a very long time before we felt comfortable traveling together again. The moving truck and all our belongings were recovered, but many of our personal items had been damaged or contaminated by the criminals' activities. The 3 men who kidnapped us were eventually convicted of multiple felonies, including kidnapping, armed robbery, and murder. Mike received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while his 2 accomplices received sentences of 25 to 40 years in prison. The trials were difficult for us to endure, forcing us to relive every terrifying moment. But we knew that our testimony was crucial to ensuring that these dangerous criminals could never hurt anyone else again. Today, Jason and I both work in California and have built successful careers and lives for ourselves on the West Coast. But we will never forget those 3 harrowing hours when we came closer to death than either of us ever wants to experience again. The experience taught us that true evil can appear anywhere, even in places that seem safe and normal, and that the fragile line between a routine stop and a life-threatening situation can be crossed in an instant. We now carry emergency communication devices whenever we travel, and we have developed detailed safety protocols for any trips that take us through remote areas. Most importantly, we have learned to trust our instincts without question when something feels wrong, even if we can't immediately identify what the threat might be. The criminals who targeted us were experts at identifying and exploiting vulnerable travelers, but they made the mistake of underestimating our determination to survive and our ability to work together under extreme pressure. Our escape probably saved not only our own lives, but the lives of countless future victims who would have been targeted by these predators if they had remained free. Story 5. My name is Princeton, and this story takes place 3 years after the terrifying reality-bending experience I shared with my friends Jackson and Camden in the desert. I was 25 years old, working as an accountant for a small firm in Columbus, Ohio. The supernatural encounter we had with the thing that stalked our RV had changed me in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. But I hoped, that I had managed to put those experiences behind me. I was wrong. It was a cold, bleak November evening in 2022, and I was driving home from a client meeting that had run much later than expected. I had been working on tax preparation for a manufacturing company located about 2 hours north of Columbus. And by the time we finished meticulously going through their books, it was already past 9 o'clock at night. The drive home normally took me about 2 hours on familiar, well-lit highways, but I was exhausted, and the thought of the long trip through the dark, rural stretches of Ohio filled me with a vague sense of dread. My car was a reliable 2019 Solara sedan that had never given me any problems. I had driven this exact route dozens of times over the past year as part of my regular client visits, so I knew every exit, every curve, and every landmark along the way. The highways were well maintained and usually had a decent flow of traffic, even late at night. So I felt reasonably comfortable making the drive despite my fatigue. About 30 minutes into my journey home, I decided to take a shortcut that, according to the signs, would save me about 20 minutes and allow me to bypass some frustrating construction that had been slowing traffic on the main highway. I had seen signs for this alternate route during my previous trips, but had never actually taken it before. According to my GPS, it was a state highway that would eventually connect back to the main interstate about 15 miles south of my usual route. I turned off at the designated exit and found myself on a narrow 2-lane road that cut through heavily forested, almost suffocatingly dark areas. The road was in good condition and had clear lane markings, but it was far more isolated than I had anticipated. I hadn't seen another vehicle since leaving the main highway, and there were no houses, no businesses, and no streetlights to break the oppressive, inky blackness anywhere along the route. After driving for about 45 minutes on this alternate highway, I began to realize that something was profoundly wrong. According to my GPS, I should have reached the connection point with the main interstate by now. But there were no signs indicating that I was approaching any major highway. In fact, I hadn't seen any road signs at all for the past 20 miles, which was highly unusual for any public highway in Ohio. I tried to recalculate my route using the GPS, but the system kept insisting that I was on the correct road and that my destination was still ahead of me. However, the estimated arrival time kept increasing rather than decreasing as I drove, the numbers on the screen mocking my progress. The GPS showed that I had been traveling for over an hour, but according to the system, I was still more than an hour away from home. That was when I started noticing the other vehicles. At first, I was relieved to see the warm glow of headlights in my rearview mirror, thinking that I had finally encountered another driver on this lonely, forgotten road. But as the vehicle drew closer, I could see that it was an old, boxy pickup truck that looked like it was from the 1970s or 1980s. The truck was in pristine, almost showroom condition, as if it had just rolled off a factory floor, but its design was clearly from decades ago. The truck followed me for several miles, maintaining a perfect, consistent distance behind my car. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it matched my speed exactly. I tried to change lanes to let it pass, but there was only one lane in each direction on this strange highway, so that wasn't an option. More vehicles began to appear, both behind me and in the oncoming lane, emerging from the darkness like spectral apparitions. There was a long, boat-like sedan from the 1960s, a wood-paneled station wagon that looked like it was from the 1950s, and even what appeared to be a genuine Model T Ford from the early 1900s, chugging along impossibly in the night. All of the vehicles were in perfect, immaculate condition despite their obvious age, and all of them had drivers who seemed to be staring directly at me as they passed. The drivers themselves looked wrong, somehow fundamentally out of place. They were wearing clothing that matched the era of their vehicles, but their faces were pale, waxen, and utterly expressionless in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. None of them seemed to be looking at the road ahead. Instead, they all slowly turned their heads to watch me as they drove by, their eyes never blinking or moving away from my car, their gazes cold and penetrating. I fumbled for my cell phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal anywhere along this highway. This was extremely unusual. Cell coverage in Ohio is generally excellent, even in the most rural areas. I also tried using my car's built-in emergency assistance system, but it couldn't establish a connection to the monitoring service, the button silent and useless. The road itself began to look different as well. The smooth pavement started showing signs of age and wear that hadn't been there earlier in my drive. The lane markings became faded and unclear, and the modern metal guardrails along the roadside morphed into old, weathered wooden posts connected by sagging wire fencing. Most disturbing of all, I began to see signs along the roadside that made no logical sense. There were billboards advertising businesses that had gone defunct decades ago, using logos and slogans that I vaguely recognized from old photographs and history books. Gas station signs showed prices that hadn't been valid since the 1970s, and faded restaurant advertisements promoted menu items and prices from a bygone, forgotten era. I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that I was not driving on a normal highway in present-day Ohio. Somehow I had strayed onto a road that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. A place populated by spectral drivers from different decades who were all traveling toward unknown and perhaps unreachable destinations. The other drivers began to behave more aggressively as I continued down this impossible highway. They would pull up alongside my car and pace me for miles, their silent passengers pointing at me and making strange, indecipherable gestures. Some of them seemed to be trying to force me to pull over, swerving menacingly toward my lane and honking their ancient horns in strange, rhythmic patterns that sounded like they were trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel. My only hope that I would eventually find an exit or an intersection that would allow me to get off this nightmare highway and back to the familiar, predictable roads of my own time. But every mile that passed only brought more vintage vehicles and more bizarre, jarring signs of temporal displacement. I saw road construction crews using steam-powered equipment from the 1930s, ghostly hitchhikers wearing clothing from various decades, and even horse-drawn carriages sharing the road with the automobiles. After what felt like an eternity of driving, I saw a sign looming ahead that read, "Welcome to Millfield, founded 1823, population 2,847. I had never heard of any town called Millfield in Ohio, and the sign with its crisp, fresh paint looked like it had been put up just yesterday despite referencing a founding date from the early 1800s. The exit for Millfield appeared to be my only possible escape from this nightmare highway. I took the exit and found myself driving down the main street of what appeared to be a small town preserved perfectly from the early 20th century. The buildings were all period-appropriate architecture. The streetlights were old-fashioned gas lamps that cast a soft, flickering glow, and the few people I could see walking on the sidewalks were dressed in clothing from various historical periods. In the town center, I found a gas station that looked like it was straight out of the 1950s, complete with full-service pumps and a uniformed attendant from that era. I pulled up to the pumps, desperately hoping that someone, anyone, could give me directions back to a highway I recognized. The attendant approached my modern car with a friendly, knowing smile and asked if I needed gas. When I explained that I was hopelessly lost and just trying to get back to the main interstate, his expression shifted to one of genuine concern and sympathy. He told me that many travelers ended up in Millfield by accident and that getting back to the outside roads was not always easy. He explained that the highway I had been driving on was known as the Eternal Route, and that it connected different periods of time rather than different geographical locations. He said that drivers who found themselves on the Eternal Route were usually people who were at a significant crossroads in their lives, facing important decisions or dealing with unresolved issues from their past. The attendant said that the only way to get back to normal roads was to understand why I had been drawn to the Eternal Route in the first place. He asked me about recent events in my life, and I found myself, to my own surprise, telling him everything about the supernatural experience I had shared with Jackson and Camden in the desert 3 years earlier. I explained how that terrifying encounter had completely shattered my perspective on reality and left me questioning the fundamental things I had always taken for granted. I admitted that I had been struggling with anxiety and a deep-seated depression ever since returning from that trip, and that I had been avoiding close relationships because I was terrified of putting other people in danger. The attendant listened carefully to my entire story and then nodded, a look of profound understanding in his eyes. He said that survivors of supernatural encounters often found themselves drawn to the Eternal Route because they were desperately searching for answers or trying to escape from memories that they simply could not process. The highway offered a temporary, surreal refuge from normal reality, but staying on it permanently meant giving up any chance of moving forward with one's life. He told me that if I truly wanted to return to the present day, I needed to accept what had happened in the desert and find a way to integrate that horrifying experience into my understanding of the world. He explained that running away from supernatural encounters or trying to pretend they never happened would only lead to more encounters with things that exist just outside the boundaries of normal reality. The attendant gave me specific, precise directions for getting back to a highway that would take me home. But he warned me that the route would only work if I was genuinely ready to face my fears and move forward with my life. If I was still trying to escape or deny what I had experienced, I would inevitably end up right back on the Eternal Route again. I thanked him for his help and followed his directions meticulously. The road he directed me to looked reassuringly normal and modern, with proper signage and contemporary vehicles. Within an hour, I was back on familiar highways and heading toward Columbus. When I finally arrived home, I discovered that according to all the clocks in my house, I had only been gone for about 3 hours in total, exactly how long the original drive should have taken. It was as if my bizarre detour through the Eternal Route had occurred entirely outside of normal time, allowing me to return to the present moment without losing any actual time at all. The experience on the ghost highway forced me to confront the hard fact that I had been living in a state of deep denial about what happened in the desert. I had been desperately trying to convince myself that the supernatural encounter was just a shared hallucination or a strange misunderstanding, rather than accepting the terrifying truth that there are aspects of reality that cannot be explained by conventional logic. Over the following weeks, I began seeking therapy to help me process both the desert experience and my surreal night on the Eternal Route. I also reconnected with Jackson and Camden, and for the first time we started talking openly and honestly about how our supernatural encounter had affected each of us. We realized that we had all been struggling with similar issues related to accepting the unbelievable reality of what we had witnessed. Working through these complex issues with professional help and the crucial support of friends who had shared the very same experience made a significant difference in my mental health and my overall outlook on life. I learned that trying to suppress or deny traumatic experiences, even supernatural ones, only gives them more power to control your thoughts and behavior. I never encountered the Eternal Route again after that night in November. I believe this is because I finally accepted that there are mysteries in the world that cannot be fully understood or explained, and that encountering the supernatural does not necessarily mean that you are going crazy, or that your life is doomed to be dominated by fear. The Ghost Highway taught me that running away from difficult experiences, whether they are natural or supernatural, ultimately leads to becoming lost in ways that are far more dangerous and profound than facing those experiences directly. Sometimes the scariest journey is the one that leads you back to your normal life, because it requires acknowledging that normal life can include encounters with things that fundamentally challenge our basic assumptions about reality. Today, I work as a consultant, helping other people who have survived supernatural encounters or unexplained phenomena. Many of them have described being drawn to isolated roads, abandoned buildings, or other liminal spaces where the boundaries between different realities seem to be thinner. By sharing my story about the Eternal Route, I try to help them understand that healing requires integration rather than escape. The supernatural is real, but it does not have to control your life. Sometimes the most important journey is the one that brings you back home to yourself, even if that journey takes you through places that exist far outside the normal rules of time and space. Story 6. My name is Jackson, and this is the final story I feel compelled to tell about my encounters with the supernatural along America's highways. After surviving that waking nightmare with the skinwalker in the desert, I truly thought I had experienced the absolute worst that the road could possibly throw at me. I was wrong. In December of 2023, 3 years after that first terrifying encounter, I found myself trapped in a situation that fundamentally challenged everything I thought I knew about time, space, and the very nature of reality itself. I was driving from Cleveland to Chicago for a crucial job interview at a marketing firm that had the potential to completely change my career trajectory. At 26 years old, I had been working in digital marketing for several years. But this opportunity represented a significant step up in terms of both responsibility and compensation. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning, so I had planned to drive out on Sunday and spend the night at a hotel near their offices to be fresh and prepared. The drive from Cleveland to Chicago is normally straightforward and uneventful, about 5.5 hours of mostly monotonous interstate highway travel. I left home around 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, planning to arrive in Chicago with plenty of time to find my hotel, get a good dinner, and mentally prepare for the interview. My car was the same reliable Axiom sedan I had been driving since college, and I had made this exact trip several times before without any problems. The weather was cold but clear, with light traffic that made for easy, stress-free driving through Ohio and into Indiana. I was making excellent time and feeling genuinely optimistic about both the interview and my chances of landing the position. The hiring manager had been enthusiastic during our phone conversations, and I felt confident that my experience and portfolio would make a strong impression. About 4 hours into the drive, somewhere in the flat, forgettable landscape of northern Indiana, I started feeling tired and decided to stop for coffee and a quick break. I had been seeing billboards for a large rest area called Horizon View Service Plaza for the past 50 miles, and it seemed like the perfect place to stretch my legs and refuel for the final hour of driving to Chicago. The rest area was one of those modern, sprawling facilities designed to serve both regular travelers and commercial truckers. It had multiple buildings, including a large convenience store, several fast food restaurants, separate fuel stations for cars and trucks, and extensive, well-lit parking areas. The place appeared busy but not overcrowded, with a steady, constant flow of travelers coming and going. I parked near the main building and went inside to use the restroom and buy a large coffee. The facility was clean, well-maintained, and brightly lit with the kind of generic corporate atmosphere that characterizes most modern highway rest stops. There were families with energetic children, weary truck drivers grabbing quick meals, and business travelers like myself taking short breaks during their long drives. After getting my coffee and using the restroom, I walked back to my car and checked my phone for messages. The time showed 6:47 p.m., which meant I would arrive in Chicago right around 8 o'clock, exactly as planned. I got back in my car and drove toward the rest area exit, ready to complete the final leg of my journey. That was when I noticed that something was wrong with the exit ramp. Instead of leading me back to the interstate highway I had just been traveling on, the ramp seemed to curve back impossibly toward the rest area parking lot. I found myself driving in a perfect disorienting loop that brought me right back to where I had started, pulling up to the exact same parking space I had just left moments before. Confused and slightly frustrated, I parked again and got out of the car to look around. The rest area appeared exactly as it had before, with the same people moving around the parking lot and the same vehicles parked in the same locations. It was as if no time had passed at all since my previous stop. I checked my phone and the screen glowed back at me. The time was still 6:47 p.m. Story 7. My name is Camden, and what happened to me on a desolate mountain highway in Colorado during the winter of 2023 still haunts my dreams every single night. At 27 years old, I was working as a regional sales manager for an industrial equipment company, a job which meant I spent a significant amount of my time driving between different cities and remote client locations. I had always enjoyed the profound solitude and independence that came with highway driving. But this particular experience taught me that some roads are forever haunted by the tragedies of the past. It was a Thursday evening in February when I left Denver to drive to a client meeting in Grand Junction, which was scheduled for early Friday morning. The weather forecast had called for light snow, but nothing that would make driving particularly dangerous for someone with my experience handling the treacherous Colorado mountain roads in winter. My company truck was a well-maintained 2021 Raptor Heavy Duty with four-wheel drive and heavy-duty winter tires, perfectly equipped for navigating the challenging winding terrain of Interstate 70 through the Rockies. I left Denver around 6 o'clock in the evening, planning to drive the approximately 4 hours to Grand Junction and spend the night at a hotel near my client's facility. The first 2 hours of the drive went smoothly, with light traffic and only occasional gentle snow flurries that didn't significantly affect visibility or road conditions. I was making excellent time and fully expected to arrive in Grand Junction well before 10 o'clock. That all changed when I reached the high mountain passes west of Vail. The snow began falling much more heavily than the weather service had predicted, and my visibility dropped dramatically within a matter of minutes. What had been a routine winter drive suddenly transformed into a white-knuckle experience as I navigated winding mountain roads with sheer, terrifying drops on one side and jagged rock faces on the other. The wind was howling through the mountain peaks, a mournful, shrieking sound that created blinding snowdrifts, making it nearly impossible to see lane markers and road signs. I slowed down to about 35 miles per hour and switched on my hazard flashers, my eyes straining to follow the faint ruby tail lights of a few other vehicles that were also struggling with the rapidly deteriorating conditions. Most of the other traffic had either wisely pulled off at exits to wait out the storm or had taken alternate routes, leaving only a handful of us on this treacherous stretch of highway. Around 9 o'clock, I was climbing a particularly steep grade when I noticed the piercing glare of headlights in my rearview mirror. The lights were much larger and brighter than those of a typical passenger vehicle, suggesting that a large truck was rapidly approaching from behind. This wasn't unusual on Interstate 70, which is a major freight corridor, but something about these particular headlights, their sheer intensity and speed, made me deeply uneasy. The truck was gaining on me at an alarming rate despite the dangerous road conditions. It was traveling much faster than was safe for the weather, and it seemed to be getting closer to my rear bumper with every passing second. I moved into the right lane to let it pass, but instead of going around me, the truck slowed to perfectly match my speed and remained directly, menacingly behind me. Through my mirrors, I could see that it was a massive 18-wheeler, probably an older model Goliath hauler or a Titan rig from the 1980s or 1990s. The truck was a dark, bruised color, possibly black or dark blue, and it had additional aftermarket lights mounted on the cab and trailer that created an almost blinding glare in my mirrors. The driver seemed to be deliberately positioning the truck to illuminate the interior of my vehicle with those powerful, invasive lights. For the next 20 agonizing miles, the truck followed me with an unnerving, predatory persistence. When I sped up, it sped up in perfect sync. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I changed lanes, it followed me into the new lane and resumed its intimidating position just a few feet from my rear bumper. The driver never once attempted to pass, never responded to my frustrated hand gestures, and never backed off to a safe following distance. I tried using my CB radio to contact the truck driver, hoping to ask what his problem was, but I received only static in response on every channel. I also tried flashing my brake lights and turning my hazard flashers on and off in patterns that truckers typically use to communicate, but the driver behind me showed no acknowledgement whatsoever of my attempts to establish contact. As we approached the Eisenhower Tunnel, the longest vehicle tunnel in North America, I made the decision to pull off at the last exit before the tunnel entrance. I desperately wanted to get away from this aggressive driver and would wait for him to continue on his route before I resumed my own journey. The truck followed me off the highway and into the dark, empty parking area of a closed rest stop. I parked directly under a flickering streetlight and got out of my vehicle, ready to confront the truck driver about his incredibly dangerous tailgating behavior. But as I walked toward the idling truck, I realized that something was very wrong with what I was seeing. The truck appeared to be completely empty. I could see clearly into the cab through the large windshield and side windows, and there was no driver visible anywhere inside the vehicle. The engine was running, the lights were on, and the truck was idling with a low, guttural rumble, but there was absolutely no one behind the wheel. I walked a complete circle around the massive truck, checking every possible angle and looking for any sign of where the driver might be. The doors were closed and appeared to be locked. The sleeper cab was dark and empty, and there were no footprints in the freshly fallen snow around the vehicle to indicate that anyone had gotten out recently. Feeling increasingly frightened and profoundly confused, I hurried back to my own truck and tried calling 911 on my cell phone. But I discovered that I had no signal at all in this location, which was highly unusual because most areas along Interstate 70 have excellent cellular coverage due to the heavy traffic volume. As I sat in my truck, my mind racing, trying to decide what to do next, the phantom 18-wheeler began to move again. It pulled out of the parking area and drove back toward the highway on-ramp, its movement smooth and purposeful, still with no visible driver in the cab. I watched in utter disbelief as this massive, complex vehicle navigated the tight turns and acceleration lanes with no human input that I could possibly detect. I decided to continue my trip to Grand Junction, hoping against hope that I would not encounter the phantom truck again. But as soon as I re-entered the highway and began driving toward the tunnel, the mysterious 18-wheeler appeared behind me once more, materializing out of the swirling snow and resuming its aggressive, relentless following behavior as if nothing had happened. This terrifying pattern continued for the next hour. The truck would tailgate me dangerously close, forcing me to drive faster than was safe for the treacherous conditions. Occasionally, it would pull up alongside me in the left lane, and I could see with horrifying clarity that the cab was completely empty, with no driver visible anywhere inside the vehicle. The most terrifying moment came when we were descending a steep, winding grade about 30 miles east of Grand Junction. The phantom truck pulled into the left lane and began trying to force me off the road by gradually, inexorably moving into my lane. I could see the massive trailer getting closer and closer to the side of my truck, and I realized with a surge of pure terror that if I didn't take immediate evasive action, I was going to be crushed against the guardrail and sent plunging into the darkness below. I slammed on the accelerator and managed to surge ahead of the phantom truck, but it immediately began pursuing me again. This time at speeds that were absolutely reckless for the snowy, slick mountain conditions. I was driving nearly 70 miles per hour on a winding downhill section of highway, with the ghost truck's blinding headlights filling my mirrors and its deafening air horn blasting constantly behind me. That was when I remembered something I had heard years ago about trucking accidents on this particular stretch of highway. About 15 years earlier, there had been a horrific major accident involving an 18-wheeler that lost its brakes on this very same downhill grade. The truck had crashed through the guardrail and fallen into a deep ravine, killing the driver instantly. The accident had been big news at the time because it led to new, stricter safety regulations for commercial vehicles operating in mountain areas. I realized with a chilling certainty that the phantom truck pursuing me might be the ghost of that fatal accident, somehow condemned to continue driving the same route where its driver had died. The truck was trying to cause another accident at the exact same location where the original crash had occurred, possibly attempting to recreate the terrifying circumstances of the driver's death. As we rapidly approached the sharp curve where the historical accident had taken place, I made a desperate split-second decision. Instead of continuing straight on the highway, where the phantom truck seemed to be trying to force me to crash, I took a sharp turn onto an exit that I knew led to a small town called Rifle. The exit ramp was steep and icy, but it offered my only chance to escape from whatever was relentlessly pursuing me. The phantom truck followed me onto the exit ramp, but as we descended toward the town's distant lights, something strange began to happen. The truck started to become less solid, less visible, as if it were fading away like a heat mirage. Its headlights grew dimmer, the powerful sound of its diesel engine became quieter, and the massive vehicle began to look transparent, ethereal. By the time I reached the bottom of the exit ramp, the phantom truck had completely silently vanished. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop and sat there for nearly an hour, my hands trembling, trying to process what I had just experienced. Other truckers and travelers were coming and going normally, and everything looked completely ordinary and peaceful. I asked several people at the truck stop if they had seen a large, dark-colored 18-wheeler in the area, but no one had noticed anything unusual. The clerk at the fuel desk told me that the highway patrol had not reported any incidents or problems on Interstate 70 that evening, and that traffic conditions were normal despite the heavy snow. When I finally continued my drive to Grand Junction, I encountered no further problems. The phantom truck did not reappear, and I arrived safely at my hotel without any additional incidents. But I spent most of that sleepless night researching the trucking accident that I vaguely remembered hearing about. And I found detailed newspaper reports that confirmed my disturbing recollections. The original accident had occurred almost exactly 15 years earlier to the day, during a snowstorm very similar to the one I had just encountered. The truck driver, a man named Robert Martinez, had been hauling electronic equipment from Denver to California when his brakes failed on the same steep grade where the phantom truck had tried to force me off the road. According to the accident reports, Martinez had tried desperately to stop his runaway truck, using emergency techniques like downshifting and engaging the truck's Jake brake, but the immense weight of his cargo and the icy road conditions made it impossible for him to regain control. The truck had crashed through the guardrail at nearly 80 miles per hour and fallen more than 200 feet into the ravine below. What made the story even more disturbing was that Martinez had been driving the exact same model and color of truck that I had seen pursuing me on the highway. The newspaper photos of the wrecked vehicle looked exactly like the phantom truck, right down to the specific custom arrangement of lights on the cab and trailer. I also discovered that I was not the first person to report encounters with a phantom truck on that section of Interstate 70. Over the past 15 years, at least a dozen other drivers had reported being followed or harassed by a driverless 18-wheeler in the very same area where Martinez had died. Most of these reports had been dismissed by authorities as hallucinations caused by fatigue or stress, but the descriptions were all remarkably, chillingly consistent. Several of the witnesses had reported that the phantom truck seemed to be trying to cause accidents at the same location where the original crash had occurred. Some drivers had been forced off the road, while others had managed to escape by taking exits or pulling into rest areas. In every single case, the phantom truck had vanished the moment the witness left the main highway. I believe that the ghost of Robert Martinez is still trying to complete his final delivery, tragically unaware that he died in that horrific accident 15 years ago. His phantom truck appears during snowstorms, under conditions similar to those that existed on the night of the original crash, and it targets other drivers who are traveling the same route that Martinez was following when he died. The experience left me with a profound respect for the dangers of mountain driving and a new, unsettling understanding of how tragic accidents can leave behind spiritual imprints, psychic scars on a location that can persist for years or even decades. I still drive Interstate 70 for business purposes, but I am now much more careful about checking weather conditions, and I avoid traveling during severe storms whenever possible. I have also started carrying additional safety equipment in my truck, including emergency communication devices and survival supplies that would help me if I ever found myself stranded in a remote mountain location again. Most importantly, I have learned to trust my instincts without question when something feels wrong during a drive, even if I can't immediately explain what is causing my uneasiness. The phantom truck taught me that the highways we travel every day are more than just corridors of asphalt and concrete. They are places where countless human dramas have played out, where tragedies have occurred, and where the powerful echoes of past events sometimes intrude upon the present in ways that challenge our fundamental understanding of reality. Robert Martinez died trying to save other drivers from being hurt by his runaway truck, and I believe his spirit continues that desperate mission in death, albeit in a twisted, terrifying way that recreates the very danger he tried so hard to prevent. The phantom truck serves as both a chilling warning and a solemn reminder that the roads we take for granted are built on a foundation of countless human stories, some of which refuse to be forgotten. Every time I drive through that section of Colorado now, I remember Robert Martinez and the terrifying night his phantom truck nearly forced me to join him in whatever spectral realm exists beyond the physical highway. It is a stark reminder that we are never truly alone on the road, and that the past has a way of reasserting itself when the conditions are just right for the fragile boundaries between life and death to become terrifyingly permeable.